WJZ, New York.
America's Town Meeting of the Air. Town meeting tonight. Bring your questions to the old town hall. Which way, America? Come to meeting and talk it over. Town meeting tonight. Town meeting tonight. America's Town Meeting of the Air welcomes you to historic Town Hall in New York City for another in a series of national forum discussions. Broadcasts from a rostrum dedicated, like the town meeting of old, to free speech, honest debate, frank consideration of the problems facing America today. On the streets, in the shops, in the offices and conference rooms, wherever Americans gather, you hear opinions rise and clash.
Where does labor stand today? Is the Supreme Court decision on NRA? Labor has nothing to lose.
But why have 1 million men already taken wage cuts?
Yes, I dispute the figures. Labor demands its right to collective bargaining.
Industry has only the interest of the workers at heart.
I say labor must fight its own battle. That's the American way.
Oh, but if you let industry alone, labor will profit too.
That's
the American way.
We want the Wagner bill. No.
We want the Guppy coal bill.
No. We want the 30-hour week.
Well, then don't try to legislate it.
And so the controversy flies. Now from the welter of conflicting opinions, ideas, schemes, can we as thinking American citizens plot an intelligent course of action? By hearing all sides, by drawing our conclusions from a careful hearing of the spokesman from each view. On that idea, the Town Hall of the Air is predicated. Tonight our question is, will the demands of organized labor promote recovery? It is my pleasure now to introduce the moderator of our meeting, Mr. George V. Denny, Jr., under whose personal direction these discussions are planned and executed. Mr. Denny.
Good evening, friends and neighbors. Well, our idea seems to be making progress. Over a syndicated newspaper article by a prominent national figure, there appeared in the papers this week the following headline: Revival of political debate is present need. Idea vital to general welfare. The article written by General Johnson goes on to say, the revolution was crystallized by oratorical contests won by Patrick Henry. The secession movement stopped temporarily by the Webster-Hayne affair and finally pointed toward the Civil War by the Lincoln-Douglas contest. Close quote. There's one important difference, however, between the method we are following and those early political debates. In those debates, it was the object of each contestant to win the debate by gathering adherents to his cause. While it may have been necessary at the time, that method led to war. In our joint discussions on the problems facing our country today, it is not the purpose of the participants to win an oratorical contest, and there will be no appeal to class prejudice. The speakers who are with us tonight, and all who are invited to appear on this program, are sincerely interested in the welfare of the whole American people. They are interested in truth, and are trying earnestly to find a workable solution to the many perplexing problems before us. This is no academic discussion. We are dealing with immediate problems that vitally affect your welfare and mine. While there may be wide differences of opinion on the subjects before us, we are going to tackle them in the American way, through free speech and an honest and fearless interchange of opinion in open meetings. This evening we are going to discuss the labor situation. The subject has been phrased, will the demands of organized labor promote recovery? Mr. Sidney Hillman, labor leader, president of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, and Mr. James A. Emery, attorney and general counsel for the National Association of Manufacturers, will speak for 15 minutes each. At the close of their address, questions will be received from the audience. It is my pleasure and privilege to present as our first speaker, Mr. Sidney Hillman. Mr. Hillman.
Chairman and friends, topic is, will organized labor demands promote recovery? Organized labor's demands meet the needs of the American people. They are demands which have grown out of experience with the ills of mass production economy. They are demands which will, we believe, if granted, bring security, abundance, and self-respect to the American people. Labor does not believe that unregulated capitalism can solve the problems facing the country. What are these problems? Unemployment, lack of purchasing power, poverty, uncertainty. These problems must be solved if we are to continue along the road of progress and not drift into economic and social chaos, which is now prevalent in many other countries. We have long and now followed a do-nothing policy, still urged by business leaders. The do-nothing policy has been tried for decades. Its lack of accomplishment is a matter of record. In March 1933, as a result of that policy, 15 million American men and women were unemployed. The wage bill of American workers was cut more than 60%. Banks closed by the thousands, and all culminating in the banking holiday with the country at large on the verge of utter collapse. No one can honestly say that we in this country have not carried through the laissez-faire or do-nothing policy to its logical conclusion. Those responsible for those policies cannot even complain that a decision of the Supreme Court interferes with a thorough trial of these policies. The reason for the failure of this policy is obvious. In a mass production age, there must be sufficient purchasing power in the country to consume that which we produce. Lack of purchasing power spells economic stagnation, unemployment, and ultimately national bankruptcy. Even if in the years of so-called prosperity, American labor was not fully employed. Over 2 million workers were unemployed in the year of 1928, a year of peak production. Continuous replacement of labor by introduction of machinery has created a problem of technological unemployment. 10,700,000 workers engaged in manufacturing industry in 1919 have been reduced to 10,300,000 in 1929. And at the same time, the number of workers was being reduced, production went up 60% from 1919 to 1929. What has industry to offer to remedy this situation? I have searched for constructive proposals by the National Manufacturers Association, but I have found none. I hope that Mr. Emery will tell us tonight what he or his association has to offer as a way to find jobs for those workers who have been replaced by the millions. What has happened to wages? As I stated before, the general wage bill paid to the American labor was reduced by over 60% between 1929 and 1933. Tens of thousands of workers had their wages reduced as low as 10 and even 5 cents an hour. The purchasing power of nearly 50 million working people has been brought down with the result that the masses have not been able to purchase the products of our farms and factories. All through these times, the American people have been waiting patiently, too patiently, for the leaders of industry, finance, and the controlling political party at that time to bring forth suggestions that would make for remedy this disastrous state of affairs. All that the American people received were promises, and wait and wait. Things will right themselves. American labor does not believe that things do right themselves. A constructive program is necessary. The only way to place the millions of those who are unemployed back to work is to reduce the working day and working week. It will not merely meet the needs of the immediate emergency, but is a long-term program to meet the problems arising due to technological improvement. Our demand for the minimum wage is essential so that the American people may be guaranteed at least a minimum amount of purchasing power. Our demand for the right to organize and bargain collectively is so obviously fair and essential that it appears foolish to argue that point before any intelligent American audience. Manufacturers organize into powerful associations. Why deny American labor that very right? The right of every free citizen. Collective bargaining is recognized in every civilized country. This is the only means that labor has to place itself on an equal footing with the associations organized by the manufacturers. That right ought not to be denied to anyone. Nevertheless, it is a fact that workers have been deprived of employment, deprived of the right to a livelihood, because they exercise that right. Section 7A of the National Recovery Act was defied by most large employers. The Security Bill, which is part of labor's program, with its provisions for unemployment insurance and old age pension, is a measure which only guarantees to labor that has devoted its life to the services of industry and the country its just due. And let me say this, that especially at a time when millions and millions of people are unemployed, it is good economy to take the old and aged out from the factory and give an opportunity to those who are willing and able to work to go into the factory. Of course, should we argue very much about the need for legislation against child labor, and it is a matter of record, brought forth at hearings in Washington, that while 15 million men and women were unemployed, children by the tens of thousands were being exploited in the factories in our country. The National Industrial Recovery Act was a first attempt to bring order into our planless economic system. The fault is to be found with the administration of the Act. It is for no other reason but that it has not carried the purposes of the Act far enough. But even with the limited period of the Act and the many obstacles in the way of its administration, a great deal has been accomplished. Between March 1933 and February 1935, the payroll of the country increased 72%. Production increased 31%. And 3 or 4 million workers were added to the rolls of the employed. Compare that when the do-nothing policy of the old administration was in effect. Then practically every month in the beginning of 1933, 3/4 of a million of American labor they're added to the army of unemployed each month. Of all of these measures, minimum wage, maximum of all of these measures, minimum wage, maximum hours, security bill, and freedom to bargain collectively will aid in building up that part of our national income which goes to labor. Purchasing power will be built up to the point where the products of industry will have an adequate market. Never again, we hope, will payrolls fall to the low of 1933. Yet, business interests still resist labor efforts to pull the nation out of the hole into which their policy got us into. What was the cry of business during this whole period? Not now. Times are hard. Wait until things improve. If anything was done along this line in the greatest speculative period in American history, cut down public expenditures, balance the budget, do nothing because things have always adjusted themselves. This is still the cry of most of them, though some of their leaders have advanced far enough to offer criticism of the labor program without constructive thought of their own. When I call this intellectual bankruptcy, I am using the politest language I can. It would still be within the realm of gentlemanly discourse to call it intellectual dishonor. I hope that Mr. Emery will bring forth something which will be constructive and not merely quibbling. For instance, do you cry against the Wagner labor dispute? It is stated by the opponents of the bill that the bill, if it becomes a law, will create a monopoly of labor. The gentlemen in the steel industry, members of the Iron Steel Institute, the gentlemen of the aluminum factory, and those in the automobile industry. Their three firms control 94% of the production of that industry, who have enjoyed monopoly at the expense of labor and the consumer all these years. And yet they say they are afraid that labor will create a monopoly. Of course, they are not afraid that labor will create a monopoly. What they are fearful of is that labor, when organized, may interfere with the power they now possess to exploit labor, and that's all they're afraid of. Spokesmen of the large corporations are even trying to spread the fear among the American people that if labor is given the right to organize, the granting of that right will destroy our Constitution. Of course, it is merely sham and hypocrisy. Organized business has never sponsored a program which cost it anything or which it could not control. Look through the whole range of beneficial social reforms which have given us such social democracy as we have, from our great public school system to the right of workers to organize despite conspiracy law, to the government commissions protecting the innocent against the predatory activities of business. You will find that organized business has resisted them all. And all, mind you, in the name of some high principle, such as preserving the freedom of the working man, rugged individualism, patriotism, or the preservation of the Constitution. As if the fathers of this country never thought of anything else but to have a Constitution for sweatshoppers and for no one else in the country. All this talk will not solve our problem. Our country is endowed with unlimited natural resources, a great reservoir of skilled labor, a highly developed technology, and there is no good common sense reason why millions of Americans should be deprived of an opportunity to work. Individual greed, the desire to pile up profit in the untold millions, is not a satisfactory reason, neither to labor nor to the American people. We are at the crossroads now. People of this country, if they choose, may follow, as they have done up into 1933, an irresponsible leadership. A leadership that cannot see the problems of the country because of its utter selfishness. A leadership that has never learned the need for self-control in the interest of the general good. And if they choose that course, it is my conviction that disaster is ahead of us. On the other hand, they may, as I hope they will, choose the road of planning for security and plenty for all. A ray of hope came to the country since the Roosevelt administration has attempted to bring order out of chaos. Surely we are not going back and listen to the old bedtime stories which tell us to wait and let things right themselves, to balance the budget, regardless of the millions of men and women who are starving. The American people want an opportunity to earn for themselves a decent standard of living. They want security, and they're entitled to it. I believe that the program labor has to offer will bring a solution which will be the answer to our needs. If anyone else has an alternative to labor's proposal, let him come forth and state it. Surely with our resources and ingenuity, we can abolish poverty in the midst of plenty.
You have just heard Mr. Sidney Hillman, president of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, speak in the Town Hall, New York, on the subject, Will the Demands of Organized Labor Promote Recovery? On America's Town Meeting of the Air. It is now my pleasure and privilege to present Mr. James A. Emery, General Counsel for the National Association of Manufacturers. Mr. Emery.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the seen and the unseen audience, I've always rather envied the Philistinic position that could find itself facing a subject of discussion in which all the right and virtue was on its own side and all the deviltry and diabolic ingenuity was on the other. Mr. Gentleman has been somewhat vague in the outlining of his program. He's been very definite in the draft of his indictment. It often happens, however, that while one doesn't know where every road leads, he has some definite views about his own position. A boy standing on the roadside was stopped by a gentleman in a Packard car who said, "Boy, you know where that road goes?" He said, "No, sir." "You know where this road goes?" "Well, I've never been down there very far." "You know where this road to the west goes?" "Well, it passes the village, but I'm not sure there." "Well," he said, "you've been here a long time, but you don't seem to know much." "Well," he said, "I ain't lost." So if we're to consider tonight, as I understand it, will the demands of organized labor promote recovery? Let's examine their program a little more definitely before we undertake to advance another of our own. Because organized labor has made many demands beyond the limits of even recapitulation within the limits of discussion. The Executive Council of the American Federation of Labor has, however, on June 7th, summarized proposals of public policy representing the minimum legislation it regarded as necessary to meet the problems of unemployment and the national emergency. I quote that. These, it asserts, are 5 definite things. First, the enactment of a new act to replace the National Recovery Act, the passage of the Wagner-Connery Labor Disputes Bill, the enactment of the Black-Connery 30-hour week bill, the passage of Social Security legislation, and the enactment of the Guffey Coal Bill. In the light of this statement, we're justified in regarding this as organized labor's definite program to produce recovery. What then is the nature and what would be the effect of each of these measures by itself and all of them together? But these may be fairly described as speculative proposals. We may therefore ask that their proponents offer them to the reason and conscience of the community rather than to its fears. For sensible men regard with just suspicion either some prophet's plan for a new and better universe or the naive suggestion that one particular group be authorized to pursue a course of conduct which would make it right and lawful for them to do in furtherance of their interests what remained unlawful and wrong when done by any other individual or group. The recovery to be sought is for all and not for some. Let's examine then these 5 proposals and consider how they're calculated to operate either individually or in combination to improve existing conditions. The demand for the new NRA, as Mr. Hillman described it to you, is too vague for discussion. It expresses dissatisfaction with voluntary cooperation now proposed. It is therefore a demand for some form of compulsion to secure through federal government a return in effect of the control over local production and service which has been judicially denied. That's not merely bad law. Experience demonstrates its unworkable policy. The Executive Committee of the American Federation referred to in its statement to what is called, I quote, the advice by the Supreme Court that the Constitution in its present form stands as a barrier to social and economic progress, as Mr. Hillman suggests. The court gave no such advice. It did hold that under the commerce power, Congress couldn't run the chicken business of New York City. Organized labor, in attacking local home rule by this suggestion, otherwise ardently advocates and recognizes it in the structure of its own organization by maintaining the complete independence of its local and state organization. And no one has stated the danger of this course better than President Roosevelt when, as governor of New York, he declared on March 2nd, 1930, to bring about government by oligarchy masquerading as democracy, it's fundamentally essential that practically all authority and control be centralized in our national government. The individual sovereignty of our states must first be destroyed except in mere minor matters of legislation. We are safe from the danger of any such departure from the principles on which our country was founded, just as long as the individual home rule of the state is scrupulously preserved and fought for whenever they seem in danger. End of the quotation. The second demand is more specific. The Wagner-Connery Labor Disputes Bill proposes a national labor board purporting to equalize the bargaining power of employer and employee by promoting collective bargaining exclusively and prohibiting 5 so-called unfair labor practices. These are acts by employers arising out of local employment relations and declared to interfere with the right of organization, the selection of representatives for collective bargaining, and such bargaining itself. These local relations are to be brought within the power of Congress by declaring that they affect commerce by causing or threatening to cause disputes which may lead to its obstruction. Well, that's about as remote as the nursery suggestion of the flea and the hair of the tail of the dog of the child of the wife of the wild man of Borneo. Only employers, says this bill, can commit unfair practices. Only they can intimidate. The President of the United States declared in the settlement of the automobile strike, March 25, 1934, I quote, "The government makes clear that it favors no particular union or particular form of employee organization or representation. The government's only duty is to secure absolute and unfluenced freedom of choice without coercion, restraint, or intimidation from any sort." End of quotation. The enactment of this measure in its present form would plainly be a failure by government to perform what the President has declared to be its only duty. The bill is a clear violation of the cardinal principle of the poultry cage. It rests upon the proposition that Congress may regulate the circumstances of local employment relations. Its proponents recognize this. For in the endeavor to remedy this plain invalidity, they have within 2 days proposed 21 amendments with growing emphasis upon the promotion of collective bargaining and putting it upon the alleged threat to the interruption of commerce. Yet organized labor fought in the court the interpretation of the commerce law which it that a strike successfully preventing production in a manufacturing establishment was an interference with or a restraint of commerce that justified federal intervention. In two notable cases, the Supreme Court sustained that argument. Now organized labor asks that Congress apply a principle of regulation against which it fought to preserve the very right it now seeks to destroy. Quite apart from insuperable legal objections to the form and substance of the measures, its practical effect would produce friction and not harmony. Mr. Walter Lippmann, an impartial observer, declared that in a field requiring above all things clarity of definition, the unfair labor practices are so vaguely defined as to stimulate continuous dispute and litigation. The bill, taken as a whole, demands collective bargaining without collective responsibility for conduct or contract. For that, organized labor steadily seeks to escape the same responsibility for the acts of its agents that apply to all other organizations, voluntary or involuntary, under like conditions. This practical immunity of the unions from legal liability, said that great liberal Mr. Justice Brandeis before his appointment to the Supreme Court bench, is deemed by many labor leaders a great advantage. To me, it appears just the reverse. It tends to make officers and members reckless and lawless, and thereby to alienate public sympathy and bring failure upon their efforts. The union should take the position squarely that they are amenable to law, prepared to take the consequences if they transgress, and thus show that they are in full sympathy with the spirit of our people, whose political system rests on the proposition that this is a government of law and not of men. So much for Mr. Justice Brandeis. Well, will that proposal promote recovery? If it will, then unjust legislation arbitrarily condemning coercion by the employer and by toleration encouraging equally notorious intimidation by others is a public benefit. If an act whose obscurity will excite dispute and encourage litigation is meritorious, this is a genuine contribution to industrial peace. If to compel exclusive collective agreements under penalty with organizations which deny and evade legal responsibility is social progress, this is indeed a forward step. What hitherto we have accepted as a fundamental principle that in modern society does not tolerate any combination without corresponding responsibility for the use of the power it develops. 30-hour bill would prohibit the transportation in commerce of any goods in the production of which persons are required or permitted to be employed for more than 30 hours in any week or for more than 5 days of 6 hours each. The government is to require such stipulations in its public contracts and refuse its credit to any establishment failing to operate under these conditions. The only exceptions to the rule would be individual and granted upon appropriate showing by the Secretary of Labor. To this is attached an ingenious suggestion to be read in the light of the Wagner Bill, inviting strikes to assure the same pay for less work. Strikes to assure the same pay for less work. Thus, reduced production is assured at greater cost. Now, speculative legislation, resting upon prediction, must have its probable effect measured by authoritative judgment. Every prominent economist, every well-known research institution unite to condemn this proposal. They demonstrate that its victims will be its alleged beneficiaries. They point out that the farmer excluded from its provisions cannot be accepted from its injurious effects. The whole story of our social advance, our improved standards of living, our enlarged employment, our expanding investment, the steady increase in the buying power of real wages by continuous decrease in the cost of the conveniences and comforts of life have always rested and rest for all the future upon enlarged and steadily maintained production. The contribution of this proposal to recovery is to penalize the use of the means by which it is accomplished. Its proponents believe that they can repeat the miracle of the loaves and fishes. For the first time in history, here is a labor organization advocating restriction by law of the earning capacity of the wage earner. If that be a stimulant to recovery, hunger can be satisfied by denying food. The Social Security legislation was discussed in this forum a week ago. Your attention was directed to the fact that it represented both temporary and permanent legislation, the former clearly separable for the latter. Everyone favors temporary aid to the state to meet destitution, and contribution from the $5 billion is now here for appropriation for necessary relief. The permanent legislation contributes nothing to the present situation, save the certainty of great and indefinite taxation. And if that be a stimulant to recovery, then leg irons are a stimulant to speed. The fifth proposal, the Duffy Bill, is in effect an attempt to declare the bituminous coal industry a public utility. It would establish a national bituminous coal commission in the Department of the Interior and divide the country into 21 bituminous districts, each with its own district board. These determine, subject to the national board, the allocation of production and minimum coal prices. Labor relations and competitive standards are provided in the bill, the representation of the workers being confined to those who are members of, I quote, a national labor organization, which means the United Mine Workers. For although there are various local organizations, it alone is national in character. Recognizing that Congress may not thus directly regulate the industry, the Senate bill, although the Constitution specifically provides that revenue measures shall originate in the House, levies a tax of 25% on the price of coal at the mine, 99% of which tax is remitted to the producer who accepts the plan of control. By this means, it is hoped to evade the constitutional prohibition confronting the proponents and, under the threat of this overwhelming tax burden, compel the voluntary acceptance of the plan. The bituminous industry, thus handed over to the joint administration of a national union and the producers of fuel, is to be accepted from the operation of the antitrust law and may fix by agreement the price of this necessity to all the people of the United States. If this revolution in federal control, is this revolution in federal control calculated to contribute to recovery of the industry or of the country? Apart from its disregard of the fundamental provisions of law which it seeks to evade, it exposes many new hazards to the whole industry to which it relates. Granting a monopoly of labor to a single combination, it excludes from representation through the administration of the plan all competing forms of organization. It creates no responsibility for the execution of the collective contracts it requires, and the labor monopoly created may enforce any demand by threatening the general interruption of fuel production. To users of bituminous fuel, it will present a cloud of new and serious uncertainty. To many, it may provide a new argument for the use of competing fuels. And will that help the workers or operate effectively in a highly competitive industry and to the conditions now confronting the bituminous supply? But the labor monopoly proposed how this labor monopoly proposed may employ the power that is suggested by the existing threat publicly spread that if this measure is not enacted, we face a general strike. That's not an economic defense. That's a political strike to compel legislation. And Woodrow Wilson met the identical threat on the 27th of October, 1919, by declaring to Congress in public session, this strike is not only unjustified, but unlawful. It's precisely what the British people outlawed by the Labor Disputes Act of 1927 by forbidding any combination to put a pistol to the head of its parliament. If that be a contribution to recovery, then irresponsible control of the fuel supply encourages investment and stimulates a strong desire to make new and larger commitments against an uncertain future for a basic industry. Wherever we look over the world today, and in this nation around us, The natural forces of recovery are exhibiting themselves in every direction. All industry believes that there is an accumulating demand for production and service essential to the replacement of the parts of our hard-worn economic machine. It is eager to move ahead. It is ready to accept every reasonable risk. But no intelligent person can believe that the prescription for recovery is the multiplication of uncertainty. Our chief certainties right now are debt, taxation, and demagoguery. Unsound in long policy, the 5 major demands of organized labor threaten the forward movement they pretend to stimulate, and taken together, they present a gigantic barrier in the pathway of recovery.
Well, you've certainly heard two sharply conflicting views on the topic, will the demands of organized labor promote recovery? In a word, Mr. Hillman says yes, and Mr. Emery says no. And now the audience will be given an opportunity to ask questions of both speakers. Now, when asking your question, will you please rise and state your name, where you're from, to whom your question is directed. Questions, please. Yes, sir.
My name is Douglas Miller, Amberville, Long Island. I'd like to ask Mr. Emery if it is true that employers generally oppose the collective bargaining and refuse to engage.
Mr. Emery, is it true that employers are generally opposed to collective bargaining and refuse to engage in it?
Not true. Employers generally engage in many forms of collective bargaining and have for many years throughout the United States. It was not discovered by the present administration or by the gentlemen who act toward the subject of collective bargaining as though they were a hen that laid the first egg. On the contrary, the 2 largest employers' associations in the United States, the National Metal Trades Association and the National Founders Association, were organized in 1898 for the express and exclusive purpose of dealing with the unions in their respective industries, and did so for a number of years because before they were unable to continue their agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Emery. Yes, sir. What's your name? Demotion, Manhattan.
I would like to ask Mr. Hillman the question that just been asked to Mr. Emery.
The question that has just been asked of Mr. Emery. Mr. Hillman, what do you say to this?
I'd like to answer the question that is so well known to the New York audience. And I say, look at the record. And the record is that the large employers of labor, especially those represented by the National Manufacturers Association and our good friend Mr. Emery, have fought every attempt of labor to organize and bargain collectively. Even in the last few years, while the law, before it was held unconstitutional, and was supposed to be the law of the land, every possible obstacle was put in the way to bargain, to permit labor to bargain. Yes, they will bargain if they can control the organization of labor. If they can create an organization of labor that they can control, then they will bargain. But when, why waste the time? Why not bargain with themselves instead of their dummy operation?
There seems to be a difference of opinion on this subject. Gentleman over here. Yes, sir.
Blumenreich, Brooklyn.
Mr. what?
Blumenreich.
Mr. Blumenreich from Brooklyn. Yes, Mr. Blumenreich.
I want to ask a question, Mr. Emery. Mr. Emery seems to criticize all the suggestions proposed by labor, even the regulation by the government for a minimum wage. But I want to ask Mr. Emery whether he knows there are records in the hands of the United States Senate certain Pennsylvania employers pay to their workers as high as $2.67 per week. I also want to ask another question.
Well, one question at a time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Emery, would you like to speak to that question? Will you repeat your last question? Dr. Fulber.
The last question is, if Mr. Emery is against the regulation of wages, of minimum wages by the government, why did not the last administration prohibit a low wage, which is in the records of the United States Senate? The wages amounted to at that time, according to the press, $2.67 per week, or less.
It is quite accurate in what he states. And of course, where wages are paid of that character, if that's a weekly wage, no one could join more strongly in condemning it than I could. And when I join in that condemnation, I also urge that they should not be fixed by law, but should be fixed by the economic power of the labor groups themselves. I think up to the coming of the present administration, I know no group of men that were more determined that government should not intervene, but that they themselves would take care of their own interests by virtue of their own organization. It's been a complete change of front on the part of the American Federation of Labor to lay its tired head on the breast of government, and with other forms of relief, take its subsistence of the abundant life from that man and make up its mind never again to be weaned.
My name is Theodore Wheeler. Theodore Wheeler. From Astoria, Long Island. As a member of the Socialist Labor Party, I would like to address the question to Mr. Hillman. Doesn't this speaker believe that the workers of the United States, instead of bargaining for higher wages, and thus continue to uphold their late slave status, should aim to take and hold the industries of the land, and through an industrial union government, operate them in order to secure to every useful worker the full social value of his or her fruit of labor?
Mr. Hillman, you're probably familiar with a question like that from the Socialist Labor Party. Rather than repeat it, will you speak to it?
I'm rather a middle-of-the-road man. I don't join in the solution of the Socialist Labor Party that an industrial organization should take over the running of our government. I don't know exactly how it is to be done unless those in power will drive the American people to such desperation that anything may happen. I believe that American labor has a right, even to use Mr. Emery's language, to lie its tired head on the shoulders of the government. Tired head on the shoulders of the government. If we do that, we will only follow what his giants have done all these years. If Mr. Dawes from Chicago was entitled to $90 million of government money to hold up a bankrupt financial institution, and that is good government and proper constitution, I don't see why the American government ought not to concern itself that men and women should not be compelled to work for as low as $2.76 a week.
I'd like to ask Mr. Hillman a question. Mr. Hillman, if the violence and the coercion of one worker by another is practiced in the Minneapolis and San Francisco and the Toledo strike, by the Flying Squadron from the Mexico strike. I want to know if that practice was sanctioned by the leaders of organized labor, and if so, why? And if not, why are they opposed to the no coercion from any sort that's been advocated for inclusion in the Wagner Bill?
Mr. Hillman.
The question is asked with sincerity, and therefore will treat it that the gentleman has not the information as affecting cases where violence takes place in industrial worship. Of course, the American Federation of Labor is on record of condemning any of such acts. It's a matter of record, being stated time and again. The gentleman does not seem to know that against any violence that may result by individuals during strike, that there is ample law in every community, that our police regulations, they have the common law, and if a person commits violence, of course there is enough law to punish him. What the Wagner-Conrad bill aims at is not that an employer should not be permitted to commit physical violence. Of course, there is a law for that. But we ask that the employer be restrained from exercising his economic power to discharge a man, throw him out of a job. That is what the bill aims at. And of course, to say that labor should also be prohibited from that kind of coercion. Labor has not that power. Labor has no economic power. The individual worker cannot possibly discharge his employer, and therefore it's mere quibbling. The purpose of the act of asking that the employer should not exercise the economic power, the power he has over the jobs of the men and women, to prevent them from joining into organizations of their own choosing.
Henry, on that question. Henry, would you like to speak to that particular question?
I'm rather surprised at my good friend's contradiction. If I understood him correctly in his first address, he insisted that labor should use its economic power as a matter of self-protection, and you agreed with him. Now he says it has no economic power. You wouldn't tell that to John Lewis. Not when Mr. Lewis threatens to stop the fuel production of the United States until legislation is enacted or until his demands are granted. To what purpose is the Federation of Labor organized? To what purpose is the right of boycott, of sympathetic strikes, of jurisdictional strikes, of general withdrawals from employment asserted, unless it be for the purpose of protecting the interests of the workers? And no one quarrels with a legitimate strike. The withdrawal of men from employment for the purpose of supporting a legitimate demand and the use of legitimate means are all entirely within his power. When the gentleman says that men have no economic power, he himself is too old a student of the labor problem, too intimately familiar with his own organization and the many with which he has been affiliated, to know how to be ignorant of the many strikes that have been called, the many threats of boycotts that have been made, for the purpose of compelling the discharge of a non-union man or a non-conformist, or for the purpose of enforcing this or that demand. The courts of the United States are full of cases, and the city of New York witnessed one within a very short time, in which, in order to prevent the delivery of either non-union manufactured goods or of the delivery of any goods by non-union drivers, you threatened to tie up the entire waterfront of New York and prevent the movement of commerce in the harbor of New York until the truck drivers or the product which they shipped was unionized. More than that, the gentleman says that these are only acts of violence. Well, of course, no one is more familiar than Mr. Hillman with the fact that physical violence, bad as it is not so bad as what Mr. Taft described so well as moral intimidation, where families and men and fellow workers who do not happen to believe that the particular organization which they are asked to join is the best way of advancing their interests are followed, beset, and urged to join with the gentle intimation that it will be socially better for them and otherwise more beneficial to the general course of their life to join, while the employer is threatened over and over again with interruption of work, with disturbance, with all forms of influence which a combination can bring to bear upon him outside of physical violence as the means of forcing him into a course of conduct which not only may be unwise, but very injurious to him. These are forms of intimidation with which we are exceedingly familiar, and they are as notorious as tomorrow's sunlight.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Emery. I'm sorry, our time is up. We hope that you will continue this discussion yourselves as you go home tonight, or here in the hall. We'll keep the lights on for quite some time. And those of you who are gathered round your radios throughout the country, we hope that you will continue your discussions of this subject. It is one of vital importance to our national welfare. If you want copies of this entire broadcast, including the questions, listen carefully to the instructions given by our announcer. Now, as it is characteristic of the spirit in which these meetings are held, let us, before we close, join in singing America.
You have just heard the third of a series of 6 broadcasts presented under the auspices of the League for Political Education of Town Hall, New York, in cooperation with the National Broadcasting Company, known as America's Town Meetings of the Air. If you wish a copy of tonight's program, or any of the programs in this series, send your name and address to the League for Political Education, 123 West 43rd Street, New York City, with 25 cents for a copy of one broadcast, or $1 for the series of 6. Let me repeat the address. The League for Political Education, 123 West 43rd Street, New York City. Next week on Thursday evening at the same time, America's Town Meeting of the Air will present a joint discussion by Senator James J. Pope of Idaho and the Honorable James W. Gerard, former ambassador to Germany, on the subject, Should America Stay at Home? This is the National Broadcasting Company.